Hello everyone. Did you know that 80% of those who watch my videos have not subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, I'd truly appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. Also, don't forget to leave a like and tell us your thoughts in the comments. It really helps the channel grow. Thank you for watching. I've been a lighthouse keeper for 15 years. 5 rotations, 5 different stations up and down the coast. Most people think it's romantic work. Solitary, peaceful, just you and the ocean. They're wrong. The isolation does something to you. Changes the way you see things, the way you hear things. Makes you question what's real and what's just your mind trying to fill the silence with something. Anything. But what I'm about to tell you isn't isolation playing tricks. This is what happened to me during my first rotation. The experience that made me understand why so many keepers request early extraction, why some don't come back at all. My first rotation was Harrow Point Lighthouse, 6 weeks alone starting in November. The station manager who briefed me mentioned the previous keeper had left early. Personal reasons, he said, but he wouldn't elaborate. When I pressed him for details, he just looked away and shuffled through the paperwork on his desk. Just handed me the keys and the protocols and told me the boat would return in mid-December. The lighthouse itself was built in 1887, perched on a rocky outcrop 3 miles from the mainland. The tower rose 80 feet above the churning water, its white paint peeling in places where the salt air had eaten through the protective coating. During my briefing, I'd learned that Harrow Point had one of the highest keeper turnover rates on the entire coast. They told me it was because of the harsh conditions, the brutal winter storms that sometimes lasted for days. But there was something in the way they said it that made me think there was more to the story. The captain who dropped me off was more direct. He helped me unload my gear onto the narrow dock, then paused before climbing back onto his boat. His weathered face was serious, his eyes searching mine as if trying to gauge something. "The isolation gets to people out here," he said. "Plays tricks on your mind. You start hearing things that aren't there, seeing things in the water, shadows that move wrong, sounds that don't make sense. Don't let it get to you." I told him I'd be fine. I'd read about the psychological effects of isolation in my training. The hallucinations, the auditory distortions, the way your brain tries to create patterns and meaning where there is none. I thought I was prepared. I thought knowing about it would be enough to protect me. I watched his boat disappear into the fog, the sound of its engine fading until there was nothing but the crash of waves against rock. Then I turned and climbed the rusted metal stairs to the lighthouse door, my supplies heavy on my back. The first night was quiet. Too quiet. I'd never experienced silence like that before. No traffic, no voices, no background noise of any kind. No hum of electricity, no distant sirens, no sounds of neighbors moving in adjacent apartments. Just the wind and the waves and the slow rotation of the beacon light sweeping across my room every few seconds. The beam would slide across the wall, illuminate the sparse furniture for a moment, then disappear into darkness again. I lay on the cot, watching the light come and go, counting the rotations, trying to use the rhythm to lull myself to sleep, and eventually I did. I woke up at 3:14 a.m. to a scraping sound coming from above, metal against stone, slow and deliberate. It reminded me of a blade being dragged across concrete, that teeth-aching screech that makes your spine tighten. It was coming from the beacon room at the top of the lighthouse. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the spiral stairs, my bare feet cold against the iron steps. Each footfall echoed up through the hollow tower. The beacon was still rotating, its motor humming steadily, but something was wrong. The light was flickering, dimming with each rotation. The steady beam that should have been visible for miles was stuttering like a dying fluorescent bulb. I checked the mechanism and found the problem immediately. Something was caught in the rotating track, wedged between the gears and the housing. A piece of fabric, or what looked like fabric. It was greenish in color, soaked through, and it smelled like death, like something that had been rotting in seawater for months. The odor hit me like a physical force, making my eyes water and my stomach turn. I pulled it free with shaking hands, and the motor smoothed out immediately. The light stabilized, returning to its normal, steady rotation. I held the fabric up to examine it in the beacon's glow, trying to understand what it was and how it had gotten into a sealed mechanism 80 feet above the ocean. But the smell was so overwhelming I had to look away, gasping for clean air. When I looked back, it was gone, just vanished from my hands, not dropped, not blown away by the wind coming through the ventilation slots. Simply gone, as if it had never existed. I searched the entire beacon room. I got down on my hands and knees and checked under the lens housing, behind the motor, in every corner, every gap in the floor grating. Nothing. The fabric had simply disappeared. I even checked my hands, half expecting to see some residue, some proof that I'd actually held something. They were clean and dry. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all evening finally hit. Rain hammered against the glass panels with the sound of 1,000 fingernails tapping, and the wind howled through gaps in the structure like something alive and hungry. The whole tower seemed to sway, though I knew that was impossible. I went back downstairs and tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, that the fabric had slipped from my hands and fallen through a gap in the floor, that it was down there somewhere in the darkness, and I'd find it in the morning, but I knew that wasn't true. I'd felt it vanish, felt it dissolve from between my fingers like smoke. Around dawn I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow, heavy footsteps descending from the beacon room. Not the quick, purposeful steps of someone on a mission, but the deliberate, measured tread of someone who had all the time in the world. I sat up on my cot and listened, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The footsteps continued down to the second floor, passing the third-floor landing where I slept, then stopped. Just stopped, as if whoever was making them had simply ceased to exist mid-stride. I waited, barely breathing, my ears straining for any sound. But they didn't resume. When the sun finally came up, I searched the entire lighthouse. Every floor, every corner, every possible hiding place, the storage rooms, the equipment closet, even the cramped space beneath the stairs. There was no one there. I was alone. The door was still locked from the inside. The windows were sealed. There was nowhere anyone could have gone. That afternoon, I found the old logbooks in a storage chest on the second floor. They went back decades, filled with routine entries from previous keepers. Weather reports, maintenance notes, ship sightings. The mundane record of men who'd stood watch before me. But one set of entries caught my attention. They were from 2019, written by a keeper named Martin Greer. The handwriting was neat at first, almost meticulous. The first few entries were normal. Weather reports, maintenance notes, ship sightings. November 12th, clear skies, light westerly wind, beacon operating normally. Saw 3 fishing vessels passing south. But as the weeks progressed, the handwriting changed. It became shakier, more erratic, the letters slanting at odd angles. The entries became shorter and more disturbed. November 18th. Heard scraping sounds from the beacon room last night. Checked everything. Nothing out of place. November 23rd. The scraping continues, always at night, always from above. November 29th. Found something in the mechanism today. Fabric or canvas, greenish. Smells like the ocean. Threw it overboard, but it came back. December 2nd. Can't sleep. I hear it moving in the walls. Something is wrong with this place. The final entry was dated December 6th, 2019. Just one line in shaky handwriting, the letters barely legible. I see it now in the water, watching. That was the last entry. The next logbook started in January 2020 with a different keeper, and there was no mention of Greer or what had happened to him. No explanation, no closure. Just a new keeper beginning their rotation as if nothing had happened. I closed the logbook and sat there for a long time trying to process what I'd read. The scraping sounds, the fabric in the mechanism. It was exactly what I'd experienced. Word for word, detail for detail. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, that there was a rational explanation. A piece of canvas from the supply boat that had somehow gotten caught in the mechanism. An animal of some kind, making the scraping sounds. But I knew better. That night, the scraping returned. But this time it wasn't coming from above. It was coming from below the lighthouse, from underneath the foundation. Metal on stone, circling the structure, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern. Getting louder with each pass, as if whatever was making the sound was moving closer to the surface. I went to the window and looked out. The beacon light swept across the rocks, illuminating them in brief flashes. Black stone, white foam, the endless churning of dark water. On the third sweep, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Wet footprints leading from the water to the lighthouse door. Barefoot prints, human-sized, glistening in the beacon's light. They led right up to my door, then stopped. Perfect impressions, toes clearly visible, water still pooling in the deeper parts of each print. I checked the door. It was locked from the inside. I'd locked it myself before bed, sliding the heavy bolt into place and testing it twice. But the footprints were there, undeniably there, leading from the ocean to my threshold. I pressed my face against the small window in the door, trying to see if anyone was standing outside. Nothing. Just the wet prints and the darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. The scraping continued all night, circling, never stopping. At dawn, it finally ceased. The sudden silence was almost worse than the sound had been. I went outside to examine the footprints, but they were gone. The rock was dry, as if nothing had ever been there. No residual moisture, no marks, nothing. The beacon failed again that morning. Same problem. Something caught in the mechanism. I climbed up to the beacon room, my legs heavy with dread, and found it again. The fabric. The greenish, rotting fabric. But this time, when I pulled it free and held it up to the light, I saw what it really was. It wasn't fabric. It was skin. Human skin, waterlogged and decomposing, torn from something or someone. I could see the pores, the fine lines, a section that might have been from a forearm or a leg. The texture was unmistakable once I really looked at it. I dropped it and it hit the floor with a wet slap that echoed in the small room. I restarted the motor with shaking hands, and when I looked down, the skin was gone again. Vanished, just like before. I called for emergency extraction that morning. They told me it would be 72 hours before a boat could reach me. The storm was too severe, the waves too high, the winds too dangerous. I had to wait. 3 days alone with whatever was out there in the water. Those 3 days were the longest of my life. I heard knocking on the door every night. Rhythmic, patient knocking, like someone who knew I'd eventually open it. I heard voices whispering in the walls, too low to make out the words, but clearly human. I heard footsteps on the stairs, always descending, never ascending. And every morning I found wet footprints leading from the water to my door. Sometimes they circled the entire base of the lighthouse. Sometimes they stopped at each window, as if whatever made them had been looking inside. When the boat finally arrived, I didn't ask questions. I just grabbed my bag and left. I didn't even look back as we pulled away. The captain asked if I was all right, but I couldn't answer. I just watched the lighthouse shrink in the distance until it was gone. 3 weeks later, I got a call from the station manager. The new keeper had found something in the logbook. An entry dated the day before my extraction, written in my handwriting. I see it now. In the water, watching. I never wrote that entry. I don't remember writing it. I don't even remember opening the logbook that day. But it was there, in my handwriting, in my words, exactly like Greer's final entry. I still hear the scraping sometimes. Late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, metal on stone, slow and deliberate. And sometimes, when I look out my window, I see wet footprints on the fire escape, leading up to my door. They're always gone by morning, but I know they were there. I know something followed me home from Harrow Point, and I know eventually I'll open the door.